All right, so today we're diving deep into something pretty heavy. How to love your enemies. And we're looking at it through a bit of an unusual lens. A talk from the October 2020 General Conference of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
You got it. And just a quick explainer for anyone who's not familiar. General Conference, it happens twice a year, and leaders of the church give talks on all kinds of topics.
Huh.
Now, this one might seem like an odd place to find wisdom about loving your enemies, but that's what I love about these deep dives. We find these nuggets of insight in places you wouldn't expect.
Absolutely. And this talk isn't just some airy-fairy theological thing. It really digs into how to deal with those super tough personal and political differences that are. Well, they just seem to be splitting us apart more and more these days. Especially back in 2020, things were pretty heated.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And the speaker jumps right in, quoting Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount. Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you.
Whoa. Okay, I gotta admit, that's asking a lot, especially when you think about the context. Jesus is talking to people under Roman rule. I can't imagine feeling much love for my oppressors if I were them.
No kidding, it's a radical concept even now. And what's interesting is that the speaker points out how hard it is to put this into action, even within their own faith community. Saying it is one thing, but living it, that's a whole other story.
Oh, absolutely. And the speaker doesn't try to pretend it's easy either. They even quote President Gordon B. Hinckley, who was a leader of the church. He said, "Loving your enemies requires a self-discipline almost greater than we are capable of." I mean, if he's saying it's hard, that tells you something.
Right, it's serious stuff.
Yeah.
That's what makes this deep dive so interesting. This isn't just about feeling warm and fuzzy, it's about grappling with a real challenge. So the question becomes, if it's that tough, how do we even begin to understand this whole loving our enemies thing?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And that's where the speaker lays out a framework. They talk about living under two sets of laws, God's laws and man's laws. They even quote that verse from Luke. Render unto Caesar the things which be Caesar's, and unto God the things which be God's.
Clever way to put it. On the one hand, we got to obey the law. That's how society works. But then there are these like bigger eternal laws. Yeah. And those two things, well, they don't always line up, do they?
That's for sure. It's like when you see something happening in the world that just feels so wrong, but protesting it means breaking the law. How do you figure out what to do? Our responsibilities as citizens and our own moral compass, it's a tough balance.
Oh, absolutely. That's where things get really interesting. The speaker gives some really practical tips for actually putting this love into action.
Okay, I'm listening. Up to now, it's been pretty theoretical. I need some down-to-earth advice.
Okay, well, the speaker starts by saying how important it is to avoid anger and arguing. They quote a scripture from the Book of Mormon, another book of scripture in their faith. It says, "He that hath the spirit of contention is not of me, but is of the devil." Pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah, wow. So they're saying that getting angry and arguing, it actually pulls us away from being able to love our enemies. Like we're letting those negative emotions control us.
Exactly, spot on. And they really emphasize that anger, it's a choice. It's not something that just happens to us. We can choose how we react to things, even when they're super frustrating, or even when they hurt us.
Yeah, we do forget that sometimes. Easy to just react without thinking, especially when someone gets under our skin. Good reminder that we always have a choice.
Right, always a choice. And speaking of choices, another important thing the speaker talks about is getting to know people from different backgrounds. They say that personal contact can help break down those walls of suspicion and fear. That's what often leads to conflict in the first place.
This is where it gets a little funny. They use an example from a musical to make this point.
Oh yeah, that part's great. They talk about how these two groups of people, they hate each other at first, but then through shared experiences, they come to understand each other, even respect each other. Like maybe you can't agree on everything, but finding some common ground, that can make a huge difference.
I love that. It makes you realize how much we rely on stereotypes and assumptions, especially when we don't really even know the people we think of as our enemies.
You got it, exactly. And that's just scratching the surface. The speaker goes even deeper into the power of love itself, drawing on teachings from key figures in their faith, like Joseph Smith, Howard W. Hunter, and Russell M. Nelson.
So it's not just about avoiding the negative stuff. It's about actively building this force of love within ourselves.
Yes, exactly. And that leads to even more practical steps, like obeying laws, working for change peacefully, and accepting election results. No mobs, no chaos.
Makes sense. But it makes me wonder, what about when the laws themselves feel unjust? Where's the line between obeying and standing up for what you believe in?
That's a great question. And it's one the speaker tackles head on. especially in the context of America.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Let's dive into that in part 2.
So yeah, picking up where we left off, the speaker really gets into how these ideas about loving your enemies play out in America, especially with all the protests and stuff happening back in 2020.
Yeah, 2020, man, that was a tense time. Felt like everyone was ready to snap. So how does loving your enemies fit into that kind of situation?
Well, that's exactly what the speaker addresses. They talk about this balance between two extremes. On one hand, you can't forget about peaceful protests and the need to fight injustice, especially things like systemic racism.
Right, because speaking out against injustice is so important. The speaker even quotes Reverend Teresa A. Deer from the NAACP, who said, "Racism thrives on hatred, oppression, collusion, passivity, indifference, and silence." Powerful reminder that we can't just sit back and do nothing.
Exactly. But here's the other side of it. The speaker also says that protests have to stay peaceful. We've got the right to assemble and speak out, sure, but we don't have the right to destroy things or mess with law enforcement. It's about channeling that passion for justice in a way that actually helps.
So finding that middle ground, fighting for what's right, but not creating more violence or chaos. I'm curious, where do you see that line? When does a protest become harmful?
Man, that's a tough one. No easy answer. But I think the speaker's point is that loving your enemies doesn't mean being quiet about injustice. It's about finding ways to work for justice while holding on to those values of love and compassion.
Okay, that makes sense. Still seems really hard to do, though. How can you actually love someone who's hurting you or your community? Feels almost impossible.
It is a challenge, no doubt, but the speaker says it's in those moments, when we see the worst of humanity, that's when love becomes even more crucial.
So choosing love as a response, even when it feels like everything inside you is screaming for something else.
You got it. Exactly. It's about breaking that cycle of hate and violence. Not about saying what they're doing is okay, but recognizing that they're human too. They deserve dignity and respect, even as we fight against the injustice they're causing.
You know, it's interesting. The speaker also talks about America being a nation of immigrants, founded on the Constitution, not on everyone being the same race or religion. They even quote these 2 Yale scholars who talk about constitutional patriotism. What do you think about that?
Fascinating concept. The idea that we can all be united by this shared commitment, even if we come from different backgrounds, different beliefs. It's like saying, hey, we might not see eye to eye on everything, but we can at least agree on these core values, these values that hold our society together.
Sounds great in theory. But with all the division in our country today, can we really find unity in a document that's centuries old, written in a totally different time?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think the speaker would agree. It's an ongoing process, not something we just achieve overnight. It's about working towards those ideals, even when it's hard, even when we fall short.
And that brings us to one of the most surprising parts of the whole talk. The speaker quotes a British foreign secretary who said, "We have no eternal allies and we have no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and these interests it is our duty to follow." At first I was like, wait, what does this have to do with anything? But then the speaker connected it to loving your enemies in this really interesting way.
Yeah, it's a head scratcher at first, for sure. But the way the speaker uses it, it's like saying our loyalty shouldn't be to any one person or group or even country. It should be these bigger principles: truth, justice, love, things like that.
So even our enemies are bound by those same eternal laws, even if they don't always act like it.
Exactly. It goes back to that idea of God's law being the highest law. Like, we might disagree in this life, but ultimately we all answer to something bigger than ourselves.
That's a deep way of looking at it. Shifts the focus from us versus them to a shared humanity. We're all connected to something much bigger.
Exactly. And for the speaker, that something bigger is their faith. They see the U.S. Constitution as inspired by God, a document that reflects those same eternal principles.
So it's not just about obeying the law blindly. It's about understanding the values behind it and trying to live by those values, even when we're dealing with people we see as enemies.
You got it. That's what makes this deep dive so powerful. It makes us rethink how we approach conflict, move beyond the easy answers, and really grapple with what it means to love our enemies, especially in a world that feels like it's designed to divide us.
It's definitely a challenge, but the speaker seems pretty convinced that it's possible, even in our crazy divided world. And they give us some ways to start putting it into practice.
Yeah, and that's what makes us more than just talk. It's a call to action, an invitation to look at our own lives and figure out how we can actually live out this radical love, even when it's hard.
So where do we go from here? What are some takeaways for our listeners? They might be feeling a little overwhelmed by all this.
That's where the real work begins. Easy to get lost in the big ideas. But the change happens on a personal level.
Hmm.
The speaker says start small. Take those first steps toward understanding and connection.
Can you give us some examples? What does that look like in real life? How do you actually love someone you completely disagree with?
Yeah, that's the thing that keeps coming back to me. How do you balance loving your enemies with actually fighting for justice and standing up against oppression? It feels like sometimes those are at odds with each other.
It's definitely a tension, one that people have been grappling with forever, but maybe instead of thinking of it as a contradiction, what if we try to understand the subtleties a little more? Maybe these two ideas can coexist. Maybe they can even make each other stronger.
Okay, help me out here because I'm not seeing it. How can you actually fight for justice while loving the people who are part of the problem? Well, I think it starts with recognizing that loving someone doesn't mean you agree with them or that you're okay with what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean accepting the bad things that are happening. It's more about acknowledging that they're still human beings with their own value, even as you're pushing back against their beliefs and their actions.
So you're saying it's not about staying silent when you see injustice. It's about approaching that struggle with love at the forefront.
Yeah, exactly. It's about recognizing that even people who are causing harm can change. We shouldn't just give up on them. We should try to create the conditions where that change can happen.
Okay, I can kind of see that in theory, but can you give me a real-world example? This still feels a bit abstract.
Okay, imagine you're talking to someone who has really prejudiced views. Instead of attacking them or just shutting down completely, you go into the conversation with curiosity and compassion. You really try to understand where those beliefs are coming from, even if you find them totally disgusting, and you share your own experiences and thoughts, not because you think you'll change their mind right then and there, but because you hope maybe you'll plant a seed.
That's an interesting way to put it. Planting a seed instead of expecting them to change overnight. It shows you that this whole idea of loving your enemies is a long game.
Oh, definitely. Real change doesn't just happen overnight. It takes time, patience, and a willingness to talk to people who see things differently. And we have to remember that our enemies, they're often shaped by their surroundings, how they were raised, the things they've been through. They might be caught in these cycles of hate and fear that they didn't even choose. So maybe our job is to try and break those cycles by offering something different, something built on love and understanding.
So we can challenge the bad stuff they do without making them into monsters.
Yes. Real justice can't be built on hate and violence. It takes a change of heart, a change of mind, and that's way more likely to happen through love than through punishment.
Wow. This is making me think about loving your enemies in a whole new light. It's not about being passive or just letting bad things happen. It's about fighting for what's right, but using love as your fuel, like it's your weapon of choice.
I love that, and it's totally in line with how so many social justice movements have worked throughout history.
Hmm.
Think about people like Martin Luther King Jr. or Mahatma Gandhi. They fought so hard for equality and freedom, but they did it with a deep love for all people, even those who were oppressing them.
That's so true. They understood that hate just creates more hate. Breaking free from that takes responding with love, even when you're facing incredible cruelty. This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive. I have to say I'm feeling challenged, but also kind of hopeful.
And that's the beauty of these conversations, isn't it? They make us think critically, question what we believe, and embrace all the messy, complicated parts of being human.
So as we wrap things up, what's one last thought you want to leave our listeners with?
Just remember, this loving your enemy isn't weak. It's actually incredibly strong. It takes real courage, compassion, and this unshakable belief that people can change. It's a journey, and it might be a long, hard one, but it's the way to create a world that's more just and more loving.
That's a great message to end on. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's giving you a lot to think about and maybe even inspired you to find ways to bring more love and justice into your own life. Until next time, keep diving deep.